Welcome, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Jackson. And like Jackson said, I encourage you to ask your questions in the chat room, and Jackson will kind of jump in from time to time and help us answer them as well. And this is a presentation that I think is super timely, and it's called The New Rules of Crisis Communications. And it's new. The new part is a couple of different factors. One is that as the nature of media has changed and shifted and evolved, a lot of the old methods of crisis communications, I wouldn't say are obsolete, but they've just had to evolve as well. We'll talk more about that today in terms of how the impact of social media, the impact of shorter news cycles, the impact of truly global media, and how that has changed the practice of crisis communications. But beyond that, because we're in such unprecedented times, whether that's the current health crisis or economic crisis or sort of social, cultural crisis that we face now, there's a lot of uncertainty for so many brands in how to deal with certain situations. And that could deal with headlines that are breaking in the news, whether it's activism or unrest or riots breaking out. Or that could also be even terms that have become popular now, such as cancel culture or certain boycotts or certain other protests, and how that affects companies or organizations or brands or individual people. So there's this new set of rules that I want to highlight. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and we're going to kind of talk about sort of the old way and the new way, how that has shifted, and then I'm going to give you 9 new rules that are really the new ways to practice crisis communications effectively. And one of those rules, I'll give you a little hint and a little bit of a preview. One of those rules involves the fact that the timeline on crisis communications actually has moved up, so much so that a lot of it, more than half of it, actually occurs before now the crisis actually happens. So with that being said, Jackson, I'm going to share my screen, and we'll get started here, and hopefully everyone can see that. And this is the new rules of crisis communications. And just to start off with, I always like to give a little bit of context for how we think about the world. My name is Ben Kaplan. I'm the CEO of Top Global. One of our agencies in our network of agencies is called PR Hacker, where we do a ton of crisis communications. And I'll only take 30 seconds to describe kind of like what we do and where we are in the world. And the rest of the time will be focused on how you can implement what you learned today. So just in terms of our agencies, we actually have 12 agencies in the Top universe. We're famous for a viral marketing and crisis communications agency called PR Hacker, but there's many other agencies that I'm going to draw upon today, including Top Data, which is a market research agency. We'll talk about the role of prepared data and market research actually in responding to a crisis, and I've got a good example of that for you. So Top Data does a ton of that, whether it's vertical specific agencies like Top Health or Top Tech or Top Travel or Top Education, or other types that focus on specific types of disciplines and services, such as Top Digital or Top Creative. So that's who we are, and just how we think of the world is we work in 7 different functional groups. Crisis communications is there in gold in our communications group. And really what today is going to be all about is from the scrappy startups, how you deal with a crisis, as well as big, huge brands where crises can move your stock price. We'll talk about why the economic value of trust sometimes is worth $360 million. We'll talk about an example of that today. But everything we're going to talk about applies to both small upcoming brands where there's a crisis that can come unexpectedly, where you don't even think you're on anyone's radar, and suddenly you are. And then big brands as well when you're dealing with higher stakes and potentially even faster timelines. So that being said, let's start off by talking about what crisis communications questions are we asking now that we fundamentally did not ask before. And I'm going to give you a series of these, and these are going to set up the new rules. So the old way, the question we asked was, how can we stop mainstream media from covering this? Or if not stop it, how can we influence mainstream media from covering this? We care about mainstream media a lot. We still do. But the new way is, in many ways, we almost care more about how can we stop or shape how social media influencers are spreading this. And so both really operate in what we call the viral circle, where coverage online and kind of social media influencers will cover mass media which will in turn cause more social media people to post about it. But what is especially concerning from a crisis communications point of view is just the time cycles involved. because social media can move so quickly, because we're talking not just a 24-hour news cycle anymore, but a 24-minute cycle on social media, it has moved up our timelines even faster. It has brought about a new set of tactics and techniques we're going to talk about, and it has put a premium on fast response even more so. And the little secret about fast response for crisis communications is a lot of that fast response comes from preparation. So the effect of the rise of social media influence, and social media influencers in particular, is that it's put an even greater premium on our preparedness to respond with bold confidence quickly. And we'll talk about how you do that. So that's the first one. Second one, the old way, we used to talk about how can we respond to a crisis more quickly. We still care about response times, but in the new way, we actually ask, how can we detect a crisis much earlier so that we can buy ourselves more time? So whether you're doing social listening or mass media listening, whether you're trying to, if you make a physical good, identify a problem in your supply chain, whether you're trying to get feedback from your customer service division to identify problems that might escalate further if they're not dealt with quickly, all of those developments have placed a premium on early detection and having a suite of tools and a suite of best practices that allow you to do that. So response time continues to matter, but usually if you're worried about how quickly you're responding after the crisis happens, then you probably means you weren't prepared enough. Another old way, new way. So the old way was, we would ask this question: how can I prevent this from getting on the evening news, right? That was kind of the sort of gold standard of dread, is having like your big crisis on, NBC nightly news. But the new way, we are still concerned about, traditional media, but we're also concerned about the question, how can I prevent this from staying on the top of Google search results? So the issue has been, if Google is in many ways the storefronts for a lot of brands, and even incorrectly reported information, or an article that wasn't fully updated, or an article that, related an issue but didn't have your response, if that lives, if that persists on Google, that becomes an issue. So what this has done is this has brought into play a whole host of reputation management techniques, where essentially, how can we sort of prevent things from living longer than they have to? How can we create positive information that can push down the negative information? And how can we use the principles of search engine optimization, how Google search engines work, to actually influence our crisis communications? And I don't think we ever would have talked about SEO and crisis communications in the same sentence, but now it's actually part of the process. Old way, we would ask, how can I minimize our haters? The people that are really our most kind of negative part of the population, or most negative group in our audience or our stakeholders, how do we minimize their influence? Now, we're often asking, how can we maximize our supporters? And we'll talk about the role of that, of how having this bench of supporters come to your aid makes a difference. So when, for instance, a couple of years back, when Starbucks had a real issue, and there was an issue in how some African-American customers were treated in their store, because they had a bench of supporters that, even though there was a lot of negatives at the beginning, people came to their defense. And as a result, this was treated eventually more like an incident than an underlying issue. And we're going to talk about the difference between the two. But instead, that sort of bench of supporters made a big difference. So it's not just about minimizing those who are most negative. It's also about maximizing and having go-to people that can be part of your base of support. The old way, we would ask this question: how can we train our team to respond with the right content or the right message? It was all right about like what was the nature of that message, and that can be difficult, right? We've advised really hundreds of clients where you want to say something meaningful, you want to respond quickly, you want to address the issue, but you're limited legally by what you can say. So part of it is responding with the right content, but these days the new way is we're much more cognizant of this question: how can we empower our team to respond with the right tone? And we're going to talk about the difference between content and tone. And one of the big things that kind of interfere with a lot of CEOs and their crisis response, a lot of brands that have good intentions or even good content or good message, because they don't think about tone specifically as its own thing. You can have the greatest message in the world, but with the wrong tone, it just doesn't come across. And so we're much more cognizant of training our clients about how do you respond with the right tone. And that can be difficult when multiple people are responding and you have, one person who's very empathetic, another person who's very not empathetic just based on the nature of their personality or maybe the context in which they're talking. And if you get that tone wrong, the message can't be heard. The old way was we would ask, how can we help our key audiences understand our point of view? So it's all about, okay, and this actually gets to the birthplace of PR and the birthplace of the press release. The press release was invented more than 100 years ago by someone named Ivy Lee, who was actually responding to a train crash and wanted to get out the company's side of the story. And actually the first press release was designed to help people understand the point of view of the company. That's important, but the new way is, how can we help key audiences understand that we care? And the reason that is important, and the reason that is important early on in the process, is because a lot of facts, a lot of response, a lot of statistics, it can take time. And so to buy yourself time for that genuine, authentic sense of caring for the situation, understanding its importance, understanding the people it affects, projecting all of that to make that clear, that gives you some leeway that allows you to get more facts and get more figures and coordinate a response. So that is, and one of the most important reasons that is even more important now is that because of the rise of social media and social sharing and influencers, the lack of caring or compassion or empathy is an emotional triggering event that triggers activating emotions, and activating emotions are highly shareable. So the issue is that if you get tone wrong, if you get that sense of caring wrong, it's more spreadable than just getting a fact or figure wrong, although that's important too. Brings us to the old way, was we would ask ourselves, how can we better measure the business impact of a past crisis? We have a lot of ways to measure that. For publicly traded companies, we do a lot with the stock price, and we can measure what happens with the stock price. For companies that are not publicly traded, there's a number of measures that we do that look at whether it's share of voice or impact on the sales cycle, or a number of other factors that we look at. Those are important, and we want to kind of do a post-mortem on a crisis. But much more now, the new way is, how can we better assess the potential risk of a future crisis? And that has really changed in our practice a ton. What clients more so, I think, want us to do now is not just do a post-mortem on something in the past, but actually say, what are the odds I'm going to face this particular crisis? How prevalent is it in our industry? And this is our top data market research agency, does a ton of this. And then how can we prepare and prioritize our response? I'm going to give you an example a little bit later from the pet food industry, where we've done a lot of work in assessing the risk. And one of the reasons that's hugely important in the pet food industry is that we know what is the likelihood that a particular pet brand will face a particular crisis. And knowing that likelihood is important for a few reasons. One, you can prepare for your crisis response on the things that are most likely. But two, it's hugely important in rallying support within an organization for developing a plan, practicing the plan, having clear roles and responsibilities for the plan, when people understand what is the potential overall risk that a crisis happens, and also what is the economic risk to us. And those are both things that we can calculate. So before I go on, and I kind of want to talk about this in a second, Jackson, are there other questions, comments? You do a lot of work too with our crisis communications team as well, from the group, in terms of sort of old way, new way, and the means in which really the rise of social media, influencers, faster time cycles has really changed the practice of crisis communications.
Yeah, well, I'll pose the question to the group. Are there any questions, things you'd like to dive deeper into, industry-specific points? I know it's interesting you mentioned You mentioned sort of the transportation industry as being the birthplace of the press release. I know we have a number of folks in the transportation space with us today, so I think very relevant. In general, though, I think that what all of this drives toward, Ben, is that because of the nature of communications today, because it's so real time and because it's so personal, the need for empathy, I think, is higher than ever. Right? It's no longer enough to let people wonder because you're not accessible. Because brands are always accessible today, and because there are so many channels of communication, I think making that personal connection and really coming forward with an empathetic approach is more important than ever.
Well, and I think you highlighted something just related to channels, which is basically an opportunity and it's a challenge. And the opportunity is, if you have a Twitter account, or this is, I said this is maybe the challenge first. If you have a Twitter account, then congratulations. Everyone thinks your brand is accessible right away, right now to a question. And if they don't get an answer to the question either quickly or one that they like, they're now in a playing field, and we'll talk about the playing field, where that is easily spreadable and shareable, and ignoring the issue, doesn't make it get better. It only can get worse. So one, there's that, but the opportunity is there's many, many channels with which to communicate with people in a different way. There's a way to, communicate in a way that can cause you to improve your crisis response, your perception, your brand very quickly. You can change your perception very quickly. But then on the challenge side again, is that there's a lot of channels and you have to coordinate all of that. And the number of times I've seen a brand, say like, okay, they're great on this channel that they were prepared for, and they are horrible on this other channel that they were unprepared for, and the tone doesn't match. I'm going to talk about an example of that. You can see that when you look at kind of Chipotle as a brand that has had its fair share of crises over the past few years. Just the coordination of channels and having a unified message, it was an opportunity, but it was also a huge problem for Chipotle because they couldn't coordinate the channels successfully as they tried to coordinate a response. So with that said, Jackson, I don't know if you have any other final comments. Otherwise, I'm going to jump in kind of my last old way, new way that's going to sort of set up the new rules. So final kind of one I wanted to kind of talk about is the old way is we would ask this question of how can we best respond to the specific incident, right? It was very incident based. And then the new way is how can we address our core underlying issues? And so this kind of gets into this difference between an incident and an issue, which is at the core of how I think in modern times one thinks about crisis communications. And the difference is an incident is a one-time event. It pops up, we're gonna have to deal with it now, and it's gonna go away. An issue is something that is more systemic, more underlying, more of a problem. It provides context. It influences how we perceive all the potential crises that come after it. And what happens is that there's very much a sense of an incident, if not treated carefully, can become an issue. And we want things to become singular incidents where in many ways our brand could be viewed as not the responsible party. It's a freak thing. It's an accident. It's something that's unique. We still have to deal with it, but it's an incident. But then the issue is now we're starting to look at our core issues and what are the things that underlie us. So I guess the point is that if you're Uber and you have an incident pop up that talks about how you don't have a good workplace, that there's not a certain workplace event that wasn't great. If it's just an incident, people understand that, these are big companies. Sometimes you have a bad apple. That's a one-time event. But if it's treated as an issue where this is a systemic problem within Uber, this is a problem in their company culture, there is something that is just fundamentally wrong, that doesn't go away so fast. No matter what the CEO says, it won't go away. So the old way was just like, let's treat everything like an incident. And the new way is we really have to look at the underlying issues. And by doing that, we can prevent small issues from becoming bigger ones. Okay, so crisis communications is less about having the easy answers than it is about asking the right questions. And those questions set up essentially what are 9 rules of crisis communications that can help you, 1, navigate current crises much better, Two, be more proactive and more prepared for future crises. And three, actually use crises as an opportunity to make your brand stronger. And we see a lot of examples and evidence of that. We'll talk about one very high profile example as well, that handled well, what a crisis does is it kind of shines a spotlight on the values of your company. And if you can demonstrate really good values, then you will actually become a stronger company and a stronger brand emerging from the crisis. Because at this moment in time, everyone focuses on your values. If you have great values, then you look like a great company. It can also do the opposite. So let's talk about that. Let's ask the right questions, and let's set up the 9 rules. So what new rules govern crisis communications as we know it? And what are the new rules that I believe should impact the practice today? So new rule number 1, assess your risk in advance. This is hugely important, and the rise of the use of data in crisis communications is that I really think it's important, and whatever your industry you're in, and I know, Jackson, you mentioned, several industries, many that we have represented here, in the webinar today. Here's the test to know if you are moving along the right direction, if you're to be prepared for a crisis. Can you list the top 5 most likely crises that are going to face your company within the next 5 years? Like, what are the categories? Can you list? I mean, you can think to yourself, I won't put anyone on the spot, but can you think to yourself, can you list those out right now? The 5 most highest risk you'll face. And then let's take it one step further. Do you know the % chance that you're going to face each risk? Right? Like, is it 72%? Is it 54%? Is this a 3% risk? Is this a 0.00001% risk? And if you can answer those 2 questions, then you're doing probably a pretty good job of being prepared for what will come. If you can't answer those questions, there's a little bit of work to be done. Let me show you how this works. So typically when we go in and assess a risk, we'll go in with what we call a threat assessment pyramid. What that means is we want to look at, first of all, can we classify risk from critical threats to severe, to substantial, to moderate, to low threat? So that's really important as part of this process, because it lets you set in motion a series of processes, procedures, best practices to respond based on correctly identifying the threat. And a lot of crises for different brands and companies get out of control because they didn't assess the threat properly at the beginning. So a critical threat means actions are being taken in real time, or severe, it's same day, versus a low threat might be handled with a totally different process. So 1, in assessing risk, we're assessing the level of risk. But 2, let me show you an example from a lot of work we've done in the pet food industry. Because the pet food industry is an industry that faces a lot of threat of sort of risk and recall and tampered with product, it's important to understand. So here's an example for the pet food industry. We'll do very deep dives for specific clients, but this is a more general approach I wanted to share with you. So if you look at the pet food industry, top 5, contamination, having off levels of vitamins and minerals, having foreign objects sort of in a package of pet food, having packaging issues, and then having this kind of very specific issue of trace antibiotics in food. And so to do this, what we actually did was we looked at the past 5 years of crises, and our team went through and looked at every one, classified them, and also looked at what is the prevalence of issues, and also what is the number of impressions, in this case on social media, that the issue is generated. So to give you an example, in the pet food industry, contamination is more than 3 out of 4 of the crises faced by pet food companies over the past 5 years. But it actually only accounts for 20% of the overall social media impressions. What does that mean? That means there's a high instance rate of contamination crises. They don't tend to be generally as severe as some other things would be, but there's a lot of them. So if you're a pet food company, you better be prepared with your contamination response well and ahead of time. And then you can see on the chart on the right, the impressions per issue. Well, foreign objects don't really, it's not a high prevalence, but it's very, very high impressions. Why? It's highly visible, right? If you like open your dog food and you look inside and there's a crazy object or animal or something else inside of it, it's a high likelihood you're going to share that on social media and other people are going to comment on that. So what does this tell us? By knowing this ahead of time, if you're a pet food company, you can start to prepare a response for your most likely scenarios. You can start to classify that by severity. You can start to understand that some things that might not have high prevalence might have a very high impact on social or mass media. And you can start to take strategic actions as a result to be ready for those. And I can tell you, if you're a pet food company, very likely you're going to have at least one of these, probably multiple of these within a 5-year span. Okay, so that's how we would do it, and that's how we can look at assessing risk. Jackson, yeah, do we have a question?
Yeah, question coming in from Daphne. Daphne says, so because the pet industry is well prepared for responding, it translates into less social media traffic, with a question mark at the end. Basically, how is it that sort of preparation can help to keep social media traffic?
Okay, sure. That's a great question. Thank you for that. I think there's a couple things. One, and we're going to talk about these in sort of the other rules coming up. But one, when you can detect it early, when you can prepare, you can address it very quickly before it spirals out of control. So what happens is, because of how social media algorithms work, right? The more people engage, and what's the highest engagement? Either sharing or commenting, more so than the reactions on a post. It's going to be shown to more and more people, right? So that can kind of spiral out of control. So one, if we know the risk ahead of time, if we're prepared, we can respond quickly and in a way that kind of diffuses. Oftentimes it can shift the channel to something else. So we might want to try to get it off of social media and into more of a private channel. We can take many other things, and that's going to have an ultimate impact on the life of this and how quickly and how we're perceived. And again, is this an incident or is this an issue, right? Is it a one-time thing that, hey, any brand can get hit by a freak thing, bad luck? Or is it something systemic? And that becomes a big difference. And so the speed of response and understanding risk helps us mitigate and minimize. I'll give you more specifics on that in a second as we get into the other rules where we'll kind of see how this works. Okay. New rule number 2, unify the message regardless of channel. So this becomes really important because companies now have more and more channels, right? You might communicate to different stakeholders that you have a certain way. You might have social media channels. You might have, things like investor calls, analyst meetings. There's many other ways that information gets communicated. And this is a great opportunity because there's a lot more ways to get out your message. That's fantastic. It's also an opportunity for personalization or customization. Why? Because you can adjust the message based on the context of the channel. But it's also a huge threat to a brand. It's a huge threat to getting the right tone. Why? Because it's easy to get the message or the tone right in certain channels and totally wrong in other channels, especially when you have different people engaged in those channels. Here is an example of this. So Chipotle, and you can see this headline here back from 2015. Chipotle is blaming the government and the media for their E. coli PR nightmare. Where did that headline come from? The headline came from the fact that there wasn't a unified messaging across channels. Why? Because at the same time with this E. coli outbreak, the company was going out to consumers and saying, oh, we want to get at the bottom of this. We want to, we don't want anyone to get sick in our restaurants. What happened was the CEO was also doing an investor call and an analyst call, and assuming that his only audience was investors and analysts, and then saying, yeah, this whole thing's overblown. So basically, in one case, at the same moment in time, the brand is taking responsibility, doing good kind of messaging practices, getting the right tone. And on the other hand, they're doing the opposite of that to another audience, not taking responsibility, putting the blame on someone else. And the problem is that's reported, that's shared. It was not coordinated, even if the company potentially had good intentions at heart. So the result is you get a company that looks like they don't get it, even though maybe parts of the company actually had good crisis communications planning or implementation. It wasn't unified. So that becomes really important. That's where some of the preparation comes into play, because you have to coordinate many people. And your message is only as unified as your weakest link, right? If the CEO and the C-suite and they're all aligned, but the intern who works on the social media account isn't, that could be a huge problem that could cause millions of dollars or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, we'll talk about Tylenol a little bit, of loss of brand equity, value, and trust simply because those are not unified. So many channels is an opportunity, many channels is also a challenge, and that means unification is hugely, hugely important, ever more so than ever before. Brings us to new rule number 3. Prepare in advance both content and tone. This becomes really important because we tend to focus on content. Once you start assessing risk and you know that, oh, there's a risk of contamination or foreign objects or these things, you start to prepare responses so that you know how to answer them, right? So they're kind of templated, they're done in advance, and then you work out the specifics that you kind of adapt them as you go. It makes you much more faster and much more confident in your response. But that same process needs to be done for tone. And getting the tone right is difficult under time pressure. I see a lot of companies, a lot of brands that can get it right, a week from now after they've talked it through. But when they know they have to respond sometime in a matter of minutes or hours, when they know they need a response that is, genuine and authentic, sometimes it's from the, even the CEO, which, one word of caution, sometimes we're a little bit careful if we're not well prepared doing that before we're ready. But if we are well prepared, we can do that. But one of the things that has to be explicit is, what is the tone? What are we communicating? How do we communicate that tone? Because you've got to be believed to be heard. And if we get the tone wrong, we won't be believed, right? So here's an example. And this is, I think, a good example from a CEO of a railway company, which just had a big crash, a big incident. Lives were lost, people were affected. And as you might imagine, if you're a rail company, you might anticipate that this is a risk you face. Let's look at, and let's roll the tape of the CEO's response, and then we can talk about being prepared for both content and tone. So Ryan, our trusty multimedia producer at Top Agency, can we roll the tape?
Because of the growing anger in this community, Robert Grinrod insisted we meet in a secluded place, out of the public spotlight.
Bob, take me back to Saturday when you arrived here. What was your reaction as you came face to face with the magnitude of this disaster?
Let's see, we came up on Saturday. There had been a perimeter set up already, so we could only get a considerable distance away. The perimeter, to a great extent, is still there. I have not seen, because of the perimeter, I have not actually seen the derailment site and the adjacent area where buildings were destroyed and so forth. I have very deep sympathies for all the people involved, both those injured and people who have been displaced. It is not something that one likes to have happen. And we spend our whole careers trying to prevent things like this.
Okay, well, pause the tape right there, and Jackson, I don't even know if you've seen that clip before, but think about kind of our prior discussion about content and tone, and what was the tone of that CEO? And Jackson, I think you're seeing it for the first time. What was your impression of kind of just the tonal quality, not even what he said? First of all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the chat is absolutely nailing it. They're saying it's absolutely lacking in there's no palpable compassion, right? There's no credibility.
But he actually said that, right? At the end, you say we have deep empathy for the people. He said it, right? He said they have. Why are we not believing that? He said it, right?
Well, it's flat. There's no emotion. There's no tone. I think Sally in the chat nailed it, saying, "Don't let him do media interviews ever again." I mean, there's just it's lacking in a recognition of the human tragedy that's just transpired, right?
Right. And so if you look at it from a content perspective, what does he communicate? I mean, he doesn't have a lot of information, right? He couldn't get near the site. He doesn't really know much. There's not a lot to say at this point, probably. And maybe, and I don't know, maybe that's not his fault, right? Who knows?
Sure.
But the one thing he could do was lead with the empathy and tone. So and how did he start his answer? He was like, it was all me-centered, right? How his day started, what he did. It wasn't at all centered on the people affected by this. I don't know if you have other thoughts. It also just kind of, because of the tone, you can see a lack of preparation. It just didn't inspire much confidence in their response, right? Because maybe you'd say like, okay, well, he doesn't seem to be a very caring guy, but at least he's on top of it. But it doesn't really come across like that either, right?
Definitely. Well, and I think that I see here Tracy saying the reporter setup was positioned as he agreed to meet us in a secret location. I think that matters too, right? I mean, if I'm, Robert's media team, I'm saying, well, we actually, this has to be, sort of seen as, and it should actually be, right, your number one priority. So we need to put you in an environment where it's like, here I am busily working on something that's important, right? I'm trying to sort of take next steps, and the sort of symbol of being, hunkered away is not a great look, right? And I see the chat saying, you mentioned this, empathy should have been the first statement, but not just the first statement, right? It's the first thing you say. It's got to be pervasive through the whole middle, and you have to conclude with it, right? I mean, it has to be pervasive, and instead, he sort of seems, one of the attendees mentioned, like defeated, right? And he got some bedhead, and he looks like he's, kind of.
And he said at the end, right? He's saying like, when you prepare your whole career for something like this, well, I don't seem that prepared, right? It doesn't inspire a lot of confidence if this is the big issue, you face. So obviously, I think, there's some tone problems here, but the point I wanted to make, I mean, there's some obvious things, but is that you can't even hear the person's message if they get the tone wrong, right? It doesn't even matter what they say. And so having a plan for the tone and what happens, and being very clear and being prepared and well-versed, remember, that makes a huge difference. And by the way, just to bring the story full circle, the headlines that this company got after this, the people were calling the most hated company in Canada. The most hated people in Canada for the leadership team, right? This escalated way out of control, because of the fact that tone was wrong. Okay, so now that we've seen that, let's look at kind of another new rule that relates to this, and how we can actually kind of apply that knowledge, that kind of separation between content and tone. So this is an example of different tonal work that we do for clients. This is I pulled another pet food example, where on the left, you'll see kind of like the instances of salmonella. This was 2012 to 2017, plotted on a chart by kind of reach potential and impact and severity. But then also starting to look at how we plan out tone, whether there's a more tactful answer or a neutral answer or a direct answer or a very empathetic answer. These are the kind of things that we would work in advance, and we'd have essentially the same essential message, but scripted different ways to get a different tonal quality based on the circumstances involved and what we're trying to do. And then again, we have to do a good job in identifying the severity and then obviously picking the right tone. This is some of the work that can be done in advance. So new rule number 4, shift the playing field to higher ground. And to really understand this, it's helpful to kind of understand, where the term higher ground comes from. Higher ground comes from a lot of study of kind of like military battles and warfare. And in general, higher ground is perceived as a superior position. Why is it superior? I think I'm not a military expert, but because you have a better vantage point. You can see your potential adversary or enemy. If they want to attack you, they have to climb a hill usually, right? It's difficult. They're gonna tire out. So it's considered a superior position. And so one of the key things in sort of modern crisis communications, because there's so many channels, there's a lot of different potential playing fields. And the idea is, let's shift the playing field to the kind of the positioning that is most advantageous to us. So what are some common shifts of the playing field? One, trying to move discussion and response in a way that is more private and less public. So if we're going to go back and forth in social media with a really disgruntled customer or user or audience member, that's not advantageous to us. So how can we shift it in an empathetic and authentic and genuine way to a more private channel, right? Can we create a system where this is the page where you go for help with your issue? There's a form on there or just a chat box that comes up where we're going to engage in a private chat with you one-on-one, and we're going to move it from a public situation where others can see it, others can chime in. It's going to be in a newsfeed, right? That's one example. We might do other examples where we need to kind of shift the nature of the conversation, and especially if it's an emotionally charged issue, because people are going to respond emotionally. They're going to respond quickly. They're not going to think. So how can we do that and give them a path of least resistance to respond in a way that is most strategically advantageous to us, that puts us in a stronger position? I'm going to give you a geographic example in a second of that. So that's new rule number 4. New rule number 5, separate the haters from the rest of the herd. And this is really an implication of a lot of the kind of developments in advertising and marketing, a lot of which our agency does, and your ability to target more people with responses. And let me give you another example of a brand that had, kind of a massive food recall. We were helping them out, and they had a lot of sick people that were in Australia, but they were a global brand. And so one of the first things we did to look at this sort of new rule principle was it was really going to affect their business in Australia. It was a big event. It was covered in the news. A lot of people were sick. But how do we protect the rest of the brand from other parts of the world like North America and Europe and Asia and other parts of Asia Pacific so it's not affected? And so we didn't think, first of all, that this is something that you could just hide. This was a big enough story that this was going to spread. It was a big enough brand. This was going to get picked up in other places. So what we looked at instead was, we've got a message proactively on, for instance, our kind of social media or accounts that are global, but we've got to do it in a way that can let our supporters, let the people that we have brand equity with come out and support us and not be overwhelmed by all the haters and all the negativity. And in particular, you can think about this, right? If you're in a situation where where the whole crowd is like one position and you're going to take the other position, that's difficult, right? Even if you believe in your position. But suddenly, if you can like minimize the noise of everyone else and just, say what you think, you might take a different position. So in this situation, what we did was we actually we wanted the message unified, but we wanted to separate out the negative from the positive. So what we did was we actually did 2 posts that were identical. The same message, the same post. On Facebook, we took one post and we targeted it only at Australia. And we took the exact same post, the same empathetic message, same content, and then we targeted that at everywhere except Australia. And what that allowed us to do is that, as we'd expect, a lot of sick people, lots of comments on that Australia post for the people who were directly affected by this or others who knew them, with a lot of negativity. But then on the other post, which was identical, which was the rest of the world, suddenly there was actually a lot of support started coming out. Well, hey, this is a really good brand. This brand's made a big difference in my life before. I know they're committed to fixing this. And suddenly all of that came out. And all of that would have been suppressed in just one post. So because of modern tools, technology, social media, advertising, the fact that you can target, you got to be careful having different messages because those messages may be shared. But if it's the same message, if it's coordinated, it's unified, then you might do different things with targeting to actually allow the positive to come out. That's new rule number 5. And new rule number 6, before I get into this one, it's going to be talking about nurture your strategic allies. Jackson, any other comments or questions on any of the new rules I've gone over? There's 9 rules in total, and I know we're getting towards the end of our time. But any other questions we want to jump in on the first 5 before we go 6, 7, 8, and 9?
We don't have any more right now, but again, I'll remind the chat, if you have any questions, please do let us know. We'd love to answer them for you, or even specific thoughts, comments that you'd like to share.
Okay, sure. Well, I think, Jackson, I'm interested in your opinion on this. New rule number 6 is nurture your strategic allies. And what this means is, who are the people who are going to be in your corner for the risks you face when that happens? And how can you strengthen those bonds? Because they're the people that are going to come to your defense. So if you're facing, you know, to use kind of our food example or our pet example, if you're facing, you know, a risk, if you're a manufacturing, you know, CPG company, you make food, you have a risk that there's going to be some kind of issue with a recall, contamination, some other issue. Do you have your go-to people that, for instance, might be other influencers, might be people that are in the food safety industry that know your practices well, that know that you're a company that's very proactive on this? And getting that bench of support is hugely important, not only because there are people who can come to your defense, but actually in sort of modern Google and sort of SEO times, you know, they're the ones who can have positive stories that come out that push down all the negative stories after kind of the negative things blow over. So what are your thoughts on that? And this idea of it's not just dealing with the negative, but it's preparing to have those supporters ready to come to your defense because you've nurtured and developed those relationships.
Yeah, I think this really goes to something that, you know, Bernadette and I were talking about in the chat. And that's that you really need a reservoir of goodwill to draw on. And that means that you can't just start communicating once the crisis is upon you. You have to start way in advance, because that's when you're going to start building those strategic alliances. And you should really be keeping track of those, nurturing those, and being able to call on you know, sort of these allies, super fans, evangelists in your time of need, right? And I think that you know, goes a long way, but you're not going to be building those sort of after the bad product is already shipped, or after someone's already been injured by your product, or after, you know, one of your employees has mistreated a customer. This really has to have started well in advance. And there has to be people out there who already know what your company values are, who already know that this is not, you know, is not representative. And I think one of the things that is kind of most difficult for a lot of companies here is that there's oftentimes not steps taken to document who those allies are in advance.
Documentation, and also just super practical stuff like, how are we going to reach them? Right?
Right.
This crisis is happening like now. We need to reach them now. You know, do we have their cell phone number? Do we have a way to do it? There's a lot of practical considerations with this as well.
Sure. Well, and one of the things that I'd point to is Daphne's posing a good sort of example. Says, I think some businesses are easier to build allies for than others, like a fun or popular consumer product versus a necessary service like transit or a utility. And I take the point, Daphne, and I think there's some creative ways that we could think about that. But I wonder, Ben, do you have thoughts on sort of how to build those strategic alliances and how to sort of get those deep relationships? If, for example, you work in the shipping industry or similar.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the key things is you're looking at partners, stakeholders, others that you interact with, and what are all the ways that you can strengthen those relationships, from things like conferences, common boards, common initiatives. So at one level, it's like interpersonal relationships and opportunities for that. At a second level, it's also about cultivating, especially in your key areas of risk, what are going to be supportive comments, testimonials, and others. And really, it's kind of like the sort of Yelp review effect, which is that, you know, the people who are going on Yelp review are in reviewing things are generally people who are dissatisfied, right? They're angry about something. They're going to go do it now. And some of the people who think you're doing a great job aren't going to go there. So part of it is, and this deals with kind of another practice that we have at sort of Top Global, which is having a definite program to cultivate customer stories, testimonials, stakeholder stories, and all of those people you work with, and having that as one, an asset to draw upon, and then two, the goodwill of all of those people based on sort of like the good work you do. So a ton of work can be done. If you're a company or brand that has, like, you do corporate social responsibility, you have a foundation, you have other aspects of, just positive, employee engagement initiatives that also affect the broader community. Those are all things that help foster relationships that can kind of nurture your strategic allies. But if you don't have the strategic allies right away, there's some other strategies. And that brings us to new rule number 7, which is prepare supporting data to bolster your response. One of the things that happens when you're trying to kind of tell your story after a crisis is you want to provide context, and a context that hopefully is perceived more as objective, right? Because everyone realizes people aren't stupid. You're out to promote a view of yourself that is positive and better than is probably the negative light portrayed in the crisis. But if you can prepare examples of data and statistics and in your kind of common issue areas, then you can be much, much better off. And an example of this, I kind of love this example because it took the brand a little bit of a while to get their footing, but then they sort of got their footing and did better. And you bet they're more prepared next time, which is, I don't know if you remember this from a couple years back, Crock-Pot. And is anyone, by the way, is anyone in the chat like a fan of This Is Us, the TV show? I'm not a huge fan, so I don't watch a lot, but I definitely tracked this and followed this, where basically in the episode, the fictional show, right? So this shows where crises can come from anywhere. One of the most beloved main characters on the show was killed because of a faulty crock pot that was old that started a fire. And suddenly, the reason this became a crisis was everyone went on social media suddenly as like, they're throwing away their crock pots, this like fire trap that's starting. So much so that the brand actually, it's affecting sales. Things are down. They're getting all of this negative news about a fictional event on a TV show that suddenly becomes a crisis. And what actually happened was, you can kind of, if you track this, the brand initially was kind of finding its own way. They did do a good job of responding to this early. They didn't treat it as this is just a fictional show, this means nothing. No, they treated it serious. But what happened later is they started being able to prepare things like, what are the statistics involved about how it's very, very low wattage for a crock pot, right? So very, very unlikely to start a fire. And even old crock pots, what are the kind of the data around potential issues or damage, or what is the incidence rate? And then even if you want to treat it super, super serious, then what are kind of the data and statistics about that? So what actually happened for crock pot as they found their footing is they had a big drop off in sales as a result of this TV show. But then they fully recovered eventually and actually even got any stronger because they were featured a lot in the news. They were able to show why a crock pot is actually, in your kitchen, one of the most low risk fire items there is. And ultimately they were stronger for it because they got a lot of attention. People paid attention and said, oh, actually there's a lot less chance I'm going to start a fire with my crock pot than 10 other things I have in my kitchen. So that's a great example. And so what I would say is if you don't have the bench of allies who are going to come to your defense, some of those statistics about how you process, how you test. We work with one of our clients, Natural Balance, which is a pet food brand that does a huge amount on being really transparent about all the testing they do. All of that data is powerful, and particularly in a crisis, it can be powerful for marketing, but in a crisis, if it's ready to go, because it gives a sense of objective truth that can help shape public opinion or a reporter's opinion in your favor. Brings us to new rule number 8. Use the positive to push down the negative. So as you deal with a crisis, and maybe there's so much negative at the beginning that you there's not going to be a whole lot of positive at the beginning. But as you start to get control of it, and as it starts to kind of plateau, do you have a plan to bring in the positive to push down the negative? Because unless a crisis is such a huge high profile one that everyone knows about, and sometimes it is, but most of the crises that most brands or companies or organizations face are not of that nature. It can be high profile for a hot minute, and then it kind of dies down. And so because of the nature of Google, because of the nature of, we're an SEO agency also, and there's a principle in SEO called query deserves freshness. And what that means is things that are fresh, things that are current are going to be go a little bit higher than they otherwise would on a Google search page. So how can you then, when the time is right, come in with other positive news, other positive campaigns that can push down all the negative news? Here's a funny example that we did for a pet brand. Because their Google search was dominated by their pet brand and the word recall, and that was going to be the first autocomplete thing and the first results, we started look at other clever, creative ways that we could change the meaning of that result. So we actually brought about a campaign for a recall your favorite childhood pet memory. We were actually leveraging off of the word recall, and we wanted to change the result that when you search for that brand and recall came up, it was actually about all of the nostalgia and the positive emotions about recalling these memories instead of recalling a food that had been contaminated, right? So I think that's important as well. And sort of in this sort of this kind of the notion that if we can drown out the negative with the positive, now you can't do that too early, but when the time is right, that's one of the new rules as well. And you never used to be able to do that before. And finally, new rule number 9, perhaps the most important one, which is rebuild the trust with bold action. And let me define what bold action means to me. And this is something that comes from, we're a viral marketing agency as well. We know how ideas spread. And to us, bold action in the context of crisis communication actually comes from viral marketing. And that is our formula for high, what we call viral velocity, is 3 components. An idea has to be simple, an idea has to be surprising, an idea has to be significant. So simple, people got to get it right away because their attention span is short. Surprising, they expect a company in a crisis to act a certain way. Now, can we break through that expectation with some type of surprise that goes above and beyond? And then finally, significance. We have to say something deep and important. So when I say rebuild the trust with bold action, that bold action part is some action that is simple, surprising, and significant, that demonstrates our core company values and why we're one of the good guys. And then if you can rebuild the trust, that can have huge economic gains and protect against enormous economic loss. And a great example of this to kind of wrap up, and then I'll end on the most important thought of the day, is the Tylenol example from 1982, where essentially, and if you remember this, that 7 people in Chicago were killed because a Tylenol product was tampered with, cyanide was put in some pills, and this was the biggest story of the month, of the year. And so a lot of people predicted for Tylenol that it would be the end of the brand. Tylenol was a brand of Johnson & Johnson. I believe it was something like 1/3 of their total revenue was based on this. This could have been the end of Johnson & Johnson. But the bold action that was simple, surprising, and significant that the Johnson & Johnson CEO and leadership team took not only saved that brand, but actually made it stronger. And so actually this whole notion of recall, which we've talked a lot about, actually stems from this Tylenol event. And what happened was there was no such thing as a recall before 1982. But what the CEO of Tylenol did was not just say like, oh, this is an isolated event that's probably happens in someone obviously clearly tampered with it, like in a store or stores in Chicago. And instead they said, we're going to recall all 31 million products on the shelf because we cannot let any chance, the smallest chance of this ever happening again. And then they eventually released tamper-proof packaging, and there was other steps taken. But at the time, no one had ever done a recall before, and now it's actually commonplace that anyone that has this type of consumer product, probably a brand has done it at some point. So that was simple, surprising, and significant action. It was bold action at the time, and it was so effective and is considered kind of the gold standard of crisis communications that basically everyone copied it since then. So how can you build trust with bold action? And if you want to put a value on the economic value of trust in this Tylenol incident, like how much is trust worth to your brand? Well, to Tylenol, it was worth $360 million. Why? Because they had a 37% market share in this product category. After the news, it went to 7%. And then they were able to rebound all the way and actually increase it because of how they handled it. So the economic value of trust to Tylenol was $360 million. And by handling that well with bold action to rebuild the trust, they actually became an even stronger brand as a result. And we all still take Tylenol today. So Jackson, that's the 9 rules. I don't know if there are any final questions. Otherwise, I know we're a little bit over time. I want to end with kind of like my one thing and kind of next steps for everyone listening that wants to implement this. Any other last question?
No more questions. The one thing I'll just direct everyone's attention, and I know you're going to go through this, but in the chat right now, we have links to get today's slides, to our YouTube channel, to Ben's LinkedIn, etc. If there are any last minute questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But for now, I'll turn it back to you.
So here's the wrap up, and then we can talk about next steps and what you do next. So number one, I want to know, what is your one thing? What that means is, anytime I do one of these webinars or conferences or speak, what is the one thing that you remember that was most useful, that you gained out of this, that sticks with you? And here's my advice. If you can just remember one thing that adds value, then it makes the webinar worth it. So what is that one thing? Please tweet it at me, at Benjamin Kaplan, let me know. Two, I have many different email addresses at all our different agencies within Top, but for this one, PR Hacker is one that does a lot of crisis communications. So email me if you want to go over your specific situation, or if you want to start doing your risk preparedness and want to get that going, ben.kaplan@prhacker.com. If you want, I do these webinars every week. Every week it's a new topic. Last week was media training. The week before that was how to new rules of market research. The week before that was brand strategy. We do every aspect of marketing. Subscribe on YouTube. That's the best way to get pinged with new content if this content is useful to you. And then finally, this is a little hack for connecting on LinkedIn. That's my LinkedIn address. If you hold up your phone, if you go to the search bar in LinkedIn and you click the little QR code button, you can just hold it up and scan my code and it will take you directly to my LinkedIn page. I don't accept all LinkedIn requests, so just write in your request that you attended the webinar. If you have a comment or your one thing, put it there too. Then I'll accept it, and then would love to engage and have more discussions about crisis communications on LinkedIn and elsewhere. So the final thing I'll kind of say, and then I'll end on the final part of the day, that if you're interested in the work we do, we'd love to chat with you. One of the things that is unique about us as a crisis communications agency and also as a PR firm is that we're 100% data driven. So we package data, we collect data, we connect data, we time data, we integrate data, we scale data. We do that for crisis communications. We do that for always on PR. We do that for rapid response PR. We do that in every aspect of the agency. What TOP stands for is test, optimize, perform. That's why we're called Top. And it's because we're so data driven and we bring that approach. So please let me know, and then let me end on the final thought of the day, and would love to chat with you further via email or LinkedIn or whatever channel. And that is this. I think that for anyone who practices crisis communications, there is great challenge and great opportunity. We've talked about some of those, but I think when you handle a crisis well, it is transformative for your organization. Not only do you potentially give a lot of confidence to consumers, it transforms your internal employee engagement, how they feel about the company when you handle it well. It influences how your partners, your suppliers, your stakeholders view you. So it can be a huge challenge. It can threaten your existence as a company, but it can also be, in many ways, if you handle it well, the best thing that could ever happen to your company. And in the same way that as a company, you would take out an insurance policy, having a great crisis communication plan in advance is part of the insurance policy you have that prevents against existential threats to your entire existence as a company, but also positions you with the bold, simple, surprising, and significant action that will build trust, that will demonstrate the values of your company, and that can position you for great ultimate success. And that's why I truly believe every company needs a crisis communications plan for their key risk factors. They need to know the prevalence of those risks and the likelihood they'll face those risks. And if you can do that in advance, not only will you protect the equity and trust you've built in your company, but you will be able to expand it when you face those kind of crises. And thank you all for coming. Thanks, Jackson, for hosting, for Ryan, for being a great multimedia producer. And I wish you all that kind of success. Cheers.